The Iraqi Republican Guard's Medina Division was supposed to be the ace in Saddam Hussein's deck. Not just any troops, the ideological elite, the guys who got the best equipment, the most training, the privilege of wearing those distinctive red berets that marked them as Iraq's finest. They'd fought Iran for 8 years and survived. They'd crushed Kurdish uprisings. They genuinely believed they were a match for any army on earth. Saddam had positioned them for exactly this moment. While coalition forces steamrolled through the regular Iraqi army's conscripts in Kuwait during late February 1991, the Republican Guard armored division sat in reserve across southern Iraq, waiting for the real fight. The plan was simple and, honestly, not terrible on paper. Let the Americans exhaust themselves bulldozing through cannon fodder, then hit them with the Republican Guard in a decisive armored battle that would bog down the whole offensive and force negotiations. The Medina Division was the linchpin. Positioned northwest of Basra, they controlled the approaches to the Highway 8 corridor, the main escape route for Iraqi forces fleeing Kuwait. Intelligence estimates put them at around 300 tanks, mostly T-72s, plus armored personnel carriers and artillery. These weren't the export model T-72s that regular Army units got. These were supposed to be the good ones. I say supposed to be, because Iraqi tank crews had no idea what they were actually up against. February 27, 1991. Day 4 of the ground war. The 1st Armored Division, nicknamed Old Ironsides, had been driving north through Iraq for 3 days, covering ground faster than anyone expected. Their mission was to swing wide around Kuwait, cut off the Republican Guard's escape routes, and destroy Iraq's best units in open battle. The Americans brought 348 M1A1 Abrams tanks to this fight. Not the original M1 from the early 1980s, the M1A1 with the 120mm smoothbore gun, and most critically, thermal imaging sights that could see through darkness, smoke, and sandstorms. Every single American tank had this technology. Every single one. The Iraqis had conventional optical sights. You know, the kind that require you to actually see the target with your eyeballs. On paper, this looked like a fair fight. 2 armored forces of comparable size meeting in open desert. The Medina Division even had defensive positions picked out, good terrain, fields of fire planned. They'd done their homework. But homework doesn't matter when your opponent is taking a completely different test. Around mid-afternoon on the 27th, a massive sandstorm rolled across southern Iraq. Visibility dropped to maybe 200 meters if you were lucky. For tankers using optical sights, this was a nightmare. You couldn't see anything. The battle would have to wait until the weather cleared, except it wouldn't. Because while Iraqi tank commanders sat buttoned up in their T-72s waiting for the sandstorm to pass, American thermal sights cut through the blowing sand like it wasn't even there. Iraqi tanks showed up as bright white shapes on black screens, clear as day, from 2,500 meters out. The Medina Division was about to learn a lesson that Soviet tank doctrine had never prepared them for. Modern war isn't about bravery or training or even numbers. It's about technology. And the Americans had brought technology to Medina Ridge that made the entire concept of fair fight obsolete. They were about to be obliterated by an enemy they couldn't see. The Republican Guard wasn't just propaganda. They actually had a real combat record. During the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, these guys had seen serious fighting. Not the quick, overwhelming victories the Desert Storm would become. Grinding, brutal warfare with human wave attacks and chemical weapons in battles that lasted weeks over single cities. The Republican Guard divisions had been there for the worst of it and come out intact. That experience created genuine confidence. When you've survived 8 years fighting Iran's Revolutionary Guards, you start believing you're pretty damn good at your job. The Medina Division had participated in major offensives. They'd held defensive lines against Iranian armor. They knew how to fight. Saddam's regime fed that confidence with everything they had. Republican Guard soldiers got better pay, better food, better living conditions. Their families received privileges. They were constantly told they were Iraq's finest warriors, the sword of the Ba'ath Party, the guardians of the revolution. State television ran footage of their parades, their exercises, their equipment. Baghdad radio announced their invincibility. The international media bought into it too. Throughout late 1990 and early 1991, Western news outlets treated the Republican Guard as this formidable force that would be the real test of coalition military power. Analysts on CNN and BBC talked about them like they were the Waffen-SS or something. Elite, fanatical, extremely dangerous. Military experts predicted high coalition casualties when the ground war reached the Republican Guard positions. Here's what nobody was saying out loud. The Republican Guard had never fought a modern Western military. Iran didn't have thermal sights. Iran didn't have satellite reconnaissance. Iran didn't have GPS navigation or laser rangefinders or any of the technological advantages that American forces considered standard equipment by 1991. The Iran-Iraq War had been fought with 1960s and 1970s technology on both sides. Lots of courage, lots of casualties, but fundamentally a war that could have happened in 1973 and looked the same. I don't know if Saddam actually believed his own propaganda or if he was just committed to the bit at that point. Hard to tell with dictators, but Iraqi commanders clearly believed it. They thought their T-72s were competitive with American tanks. They thought their training was adequate. They thought defensive positions and numerical parity would be enough. The T-72 itself contributed to this delusion. It looked impressive. Low profile, 125mm gun, decent armor protection by 1970s standards. Soviet export propaganda had marketed it as a world-class main battle tank. Several countries operated them. They'd performed adequately in Middle Eastern conflicts where nobody had overwhelming technological advantages. But here's the thing about tank warfare that the Iraqis didn't grasp. It's not about who has the bigger gun or thicker armor anymore. It's about who sees the enemy first. Fire control systems, rangefinders, stabilization, targeting computers, thermal imaging, that's what determines modern tank battles. The side that can accurately engage targets at 2,500 meters wins against the side that can't see past 1,000 meters, every single time. The Medina Division rolled into their defensive positions near Medina Ridge, fully expecting to give the Americans a bloody nose. They had no idea they were about to be in the most one-sided tank battle in modern warfare. The 1st Armored Division had been in Saudi Arabia since November 1990. 3 months of sitting in the desert, training, waiting, wondering if this whole thing would kick off, or if diplomacy would somehow prevent the war everyone knew was coming. By late February, they were ready to get it over with. Old Ironsides wasn't some newly formed unit thrown together for Desert Storm. This was a division with lineage going back to 1940, veterans of North Africa and the drive across Europe in World War II. In 1991, they were based in Germany as part of the force meant to stop Soviet tanks if the Cold War ever went hot. That meant they'd spent decades preparing for mechanized warfare against a Soviet-style enemy, which is exactly what the Iraqi Republican Guard was, a Soviet-style force with Soviet equipment and Soviet doctrine. The division brought 348 M1A1 Abrams tanks to Iraq. Not scattered across multiple units, concentrated, ready to hit hard. Each tank weighed 63 tons, powered by a 1,500 horsepower gas turbine engine that could push it to 42 miles per hour across desert terrain. The 120mm smoothbore gun could penetrate any armor the Iraqis had, from ranges the Iraqis couldn't even shoot back from. But the gun wasn't the real advantage. The thermal imaging sight was. Every single Abrams in the 1st Armored Division had the AN/VSG-2 tank thermal sight. This wasn't experimental technology. This was proven, reliable equipment that had been in service since the mid-1980s. It worked by detecting infrared radiation, heat signatures, from targets. A tank engine puts out a lot of heat. So do the tracks, the exhaust, the turret after it's been sitting in the sun. In complete darkness, or through smoke or sandstorms, thermal sights could spot enemy armor from over 2,000 meters away. The Iraqis had nothing comparable. Their T-72s used optical sights and basic infrared searchlights for night fighting. You know what infrared searchlights do? They basically announce your position to anyone with thermal imaging while barely improving your own ability to see. It's like bringing a flashlight to a gunfight against someone with night vision goggles. Our American tank crews had been training with this equipment for years. They knew exactly what advantages it gave them. They'd run exercises in Germany simulating combat against Soviet tanks in poor visibility. The doctrine was simple. Use your thermal sight advantage to engage first, engage accurately, and destroy the enemy before they can return effective fire. I sometimes wonder if Iraqi intelligence had any idea what they were up against. Probably not. The Soviets didn't export their best equipment to client states. The T-72s Iraq had were downgraded versions without the composite armor or the advanced fire control systems that Soviet forces used. And even Soviet tanks didn't have thermal sights as good as American ones in 1991. On February 24th, the ground war kicked off. The 1st Armored Division pushed north through the Iraqi desert with 7th Corps, part of the massive left hook that would cut off Iraqi forces in Kuwait. They covered 140 miles in 3 days, moving faster than intelligence estimates said they could, destroying scattered Iraqi units that got in the way. By February 27th, they'd reached the approaches to Medina Ridge. Intelligence reported heavy Republican Guard presence ahead. The Medina Division dug in, waiting. The division's 2nd Brigade would hit them first. 116 Abrams tanks moving through a sandstorm that reduced visibility to almost nothing. For anyone with optical sights, that is. February 27th, 1991. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division was pushing north when their lead scouts spotted something through the blowing sand. Iraqi positions. Lots of them. The sandstorm had been building all day. By mid-afternoon, visibility was maybe 200 meters with the naked eye, and that's being generous. Wind was whipping sand and dust across the desert hard enough that you could barely see the tank in front of you in formation. Weather like this would normally halt military operations completely. You can't fight what you can't see, but the Americans could see just fine. Through their thermal sights, Iraqi positions showed up clear as day. T-72 tanks dug into defensive positions. Armored personnel carriers spread out in supporting positions. Artillery pieces, trucks, infantry fighting positions. The entire defensive layout of the Medina Division's forward elements was visible on those green-black thermal screens like someone had drawn them a map. The Iraqis had no idea the Americans were there. None. Their optical sights were useless in the sandstorm. They were sitting blind, waiting for the weather to clear so they could actually see to fight. Standard doctrine for any military using conventional optics: you wait out bad weather. You don't charge into battle when you can't see your hand in front of your face. Except the other guy could see perfectly and was already lining up shots. The 2nd Brigade commander made the call to attack. Why wouldn't he? His tanks could engage enemy armor from 2,500 meters through the sandstorm. The Iraqis couldn't see past 200 meters, even if they were looking in the right direction. This wasn't a battle. This was a shooting gallery. American tank commanders started identifying targets through their thermal sights. Target acquisition was almost too easy. Every Iraqi vehicle showed up as a bright heat signature against the cooler background. Tank engines, even idling ones, put out enormous amounts of heat. You could count the individual T-72s, pick your target, range it with the laser rangefinder, and put a sabot round through it before the crew inside even knew you existed. I've always thought there's something uniquely terrifying about being killed by something you never see. At least in a fair fight, you know what's happening. You can shoot back. You have a chance. The Iraqis at Medina Ridge had no chance because they literally could not perceive the threat until rounds started slamming into their tanks. The first shots went out around 3:45 p.m. M1A1 sabot rounds, depleted uranium penetrators traveling at over 5,000 feet per second. At 2,500 meters, they punched through T-72 frontal armor like it was tin foil. Iraqi tanks started exploding before their crews could react. Some Iraqi tanks tried to return fire. They were shooting blind, aiming at muzzle flashes they could barely see through the sandstorm, hoping to hit something. Their 125mm guns had the range to reach American positions in theory. In practice, they had no idea where American tanks actually were. No laser rangefinders, no thermal targeting, just guessing and hoping. American gunners weren't guessing. Every shot was precisely ranged, accurately aimed, fired from a stabilized gun platform that could shoot accurately while moving. The M1A1's fire control computer did the ballistic calculations automatically. Point at target, laser range. Computer adjusts for distance and movement. Pull trigger, hit target. It was methodical, professional, brutally efficient. From the Iraqi perspective, the world just started exploding around them without warning. 1 second, you're sitting in your T-72, buttoned up against the sandstorm, waiting for the weather to clear so you can actually see to fight. The next second, the tank next to yours erupts in a fireball. Then another one 50 meters away detonates. Then yours takes a hit and you're dead before you understand what's happening. The surviving Iraqi crews had no idea where the fire was coming from. Through the sandstorm, they couldn't see muzzle flashes. They couldn't see American tanks. They couldn't see anything except sand and smoke and their own vehicles burning. Some crews tried to traverse their turrets to shoot back. But shoot back at what? Where? They were fighting ghosts. American sabot rounds hitting T-72s at 2,500 meters produced catastrophic kills most of the time. The M829 depleted uranium penetrator would punch through the frontal armor, usually right through the turret ring or the glacis plate, then fragment inside the crew compartment. T-72S stored ammunition in the turret carousel, right where the penetrator was entering. When that ammo cooked off, the entire turret would blow off the hull and flip 20 feet into the air. The Abrams crews could watch this happen through their thermal sights in real time. Shoot, watch the hit, watch the secondary explosion, watch the turret flip, move to next target. Some gunners were engaging and destroying multiple Iraqi tanks before the first one had even stopped burning. This wasn't a battle in any traditional sense. Battles require both sides to fight. The Iraqis couldn't fight back effectively because they couldn't see what they were fighting. They were being systematically executed by an enemy that might as well have been invisible. Iraqi commanders tried to organize a response. Some units attempted to withdraw. Some tried to advance toward where they thought the Americans might be, hoping to close the range enough to actually see their targets. Neither tactic worked. American thermal sights tracked every movement. Any Iraqi tank that moved just made itself an easier target. The 2nd Brigade was advancing while firing. The M1A1 stabilization system meant they could shoot accurately at 20 miles per hour across rough terrain. Iraqi T-72s had basic stabilization, but nowhere near American standards. Even if they could see targets, engaging accurately while moving was nearly impossible for them. Temperature differential is what made thermal sights so effective. The colder the ambient temperature, the easier it is to spot hot objects. February in the Iraqi desert gets cold at night, but even during the afternoon, tank engines and recently fired guns showed up clearly against the background. The sandstorm actually helped the Americans by cooling everything down except the targets they needed to see. I don't think anyone in the Medina Division understood what was killing them until it was over. How could they? Their entire experience with tank warfare was based on being able to see the enemy. That's how war had always worked. You see the other guy, he sees you. Whoever shoots better wins. This was something completely outside their frame of reference, death from an enemy they couldn't perceive. By 5 p.m., less than 90 minutes after first contact, the 2nd Brigade had destroyed over 60 Iraqi tanks. They hadn't lost a single Abrams. The final count from the 2nd Brigade's initial assault was obscene. 61 Iraqi tanks destroyed, 34 armored personnel carriers, 8 air defense systems, 38 trucks and various other vehicles, all in less than 90 minutes of actual combat. American losses? 0 tanks. Not a single M1A1 knocked out. A few took hits from Iraqi fire. Those 125mm guns could theoretically penetrate Abrams armor if they hit the right spot at the right angle. But theoretical doesn't matter when you're shooting blind and the other guy is putting precisely aimed rounds into your tank from ranges you can't even see at. The kill ratios were so lopsided that if you presented them in a video game, players would complain the game was unrealistic. 61-0 in tank kills alone. That's not a battle. That's target practice with targets that occasionally shoot back but miss. Other units from the 1st Armored Division were hitting the Medina Division simultaneously along different axes of advance. The 1st Brigade engaged Iraqi positions to the east. The 3rd Brigade swept through from another direction. Every American unit had the same advantage, thermal sights working perfectly through the sandstorm while Iraqi forces stumbled around blind. The cumulative effect was total destruction of the Medina Division as a coherent fighting force. By the time the sun set on February 27th, the Republican Guard's most forward division had essentially ceased to exist. Over 186 T-72 tanks confirmed destroyed across the entire engagement area. Hundreds of other vehicles. Thousands of casualties. American forces had proven something that military theorists had suspected but never demonstrated at this scale. Technology advantage in modern warfare isn't just an edge, it's the entire game. The Iraqis weren't cowards. They weren't incompetent. They were fighting with equipment that was fundamentally obsolete against an enemy a full generation ahead in capability. Some Iraqi units fought to the end. Crews stayed with their tanks even as American rounds systematically destroyed every vehicle in their platoon. That takes guts. It just doesn't matter when courage is irrelevant to the outcome. You can be the bravest tank crew in the world, but bravery doesn't make your optical sights work through a sandstorm. The Americans hadn't even used their full arsenal. They didn't need air support for this engagement, didn't need artillery preparation, didn't need infantry assaults, just tanks engaging other tanks with superior technology and superior training. And that was enough to produce a massacre. By nightfall, reconnaissance elements were reporting fields of burning Iraqi vehicles stretching for miles. The thermal sights that had been so effective during the sandstorm were now showing hundreds of hot spots, destroyed tanks and vehicles still burning hours after being hit. The entire battlefield lit up on thermal screens like a map of hell. The Medina Division's commander probably sent situation reports back to Baghdad, trying to explain what had happened. I wonder what he said. How do you report that your elite armored division got annihilated by an enemy you never actually saw? How do you explain to Saddam Hussein that thermal imaging technology had made your entire defensive strategy irrelevant before the battle started? The Americans pushed through the destroyed Iraqi positions and kept advancing. There were other Republican Guard divisions to destroy, other missions to accomplish. Medina Ridge was just one engagement in a 4-day ground war. But it was the engagement that proved modern American armor was untouchable. When the sandstorm finally cleared that evening, American reconnaissance units moved through the battlefield to assess the damage. What they found was total annihilation spread across miles of desert. The Medina Division had been destroyed. Not damaged, not degraded, destroyed. Conservative estimates put Iraqi tank losses at over 186 T-72s across the entire Medina Ridge engagement area. Some estimates went higher. Hundreds of other armored vehicles, trucks, artillery pieces, air defense systems. The division had effectively ceased to exist as a military unit. Meanwhile, all 348 American Abrams tanks that participated in the battle were still operational. Every single one. Some had taken hits. You can't have a tank battle without somebody getting shot at. But the M1A1's composite armor had shrugged off everything the Iraqis threw at it. A few tanks had minor damage requiring repair. None were knocked out. None were destroyed. That's a kill ratio that shouldn't exist in modern warfare between peer militaries. But Iraq wasn't a peer. They thought they were, which makes this even more brutal. The Republican Guard genuinely believed they were elite armored troops with competitive equipment. They positioned themselves for a decisive battle that would bloody the Americans and prove Iraqi military capability. Instead, they got obliterated without ever seeing the enemy. The destroyed Iraqi tanks told a story. Most showed penetration hits on the turret front or glacis plate. Textbook shot placement from American gunners who had all the time in the world to aim precisely. Many T-72s had their turrets blown completely off from ammunition cook-offs. Some showed multiple hits, suggesting they'd been engaged by several American tanks, or that gunners had put additional rounds into them to ensure the kill. The spacing of the destroyed vehicles revealed how the Iraqis had been positioned. They'd set up in defensive formations with good fields of fire and mutual support, exactly how Soviet doctrine taught them to fight. They'd done everything tactically correct for the equipment they had. It just didn't matter. American doctrine called this overmatch, bringing such overwhelming capability that the enemy can't compete regardless of their actions. Medina Ridge was overmatch demonstrated at its most extreme. The thermal sight advantage was so decisive that nothing else about the battle mattered. Iraqi tactics, courage, defensive positions, numerical strength, all irrelevant when they couldn't see to shoot. The few Iraqi survivors who were captured told interrogators they had no idea what had hit them. They described American tanks appearing out of nowhere after the battle was already over, rolling past burning Iraqi vehicles. Some thought they'd been hit by aircraft or artillery until they saw the Abrams tanks and realized they'd been destroyed in a ground engagement they never knew was happening. I've read accounts of tank battles from World War II where crews describe the terror of being outgunned or outarmored. There's something almost honorable about it. You see the threat, you try to fight, you lose. Medina Ridge wasn't like that. This was being deleted from existence by something you couldn't perceive. The psychological impact must have been devastating for any Iraqis who survived. The battle proved what American military planners had been saying since the early 1980s. Thermal imaging had fundamentally changed armored warfare. The side with superior sensors wins before the shooting starts. Range, armor, gun size, all secondary to the ability to see first. The Medina Division had walked into a massacre and never even realized it until they were burning. Medina Ridge gets forgotten in the broader narrative of Desert Storm. Most people remember the air campaign, the highway of death, the 100-hour ground war. They don't remember the specific tank battle that proved American armor was a full generation ahead of anything the Soviets had exported to their client states. But military analysts remember. Tank warfare doctrine changed after Medina Ridge. The lesson was brutally simple. Thermal imaging superiority wins tank battles before they start. Doesn't matter if your armor is thicker. Doesn't matter if your gun is bigger. Doesn't matter if your crews are braver. If you can't see the enemy and they can see you, you lose. Every time. The Soviets noticed. They'd been selling T-72s and T-80s to countries around the world, marketing them as world-class main battle tanks, competitive with Western armor. Medina Ridge demonstrated that Soviet export tanks were obsolete against American technology. Not close, not competitive, obsolete. The entire Soviet model of armored warfare that had dominated military thinking since 1945 had been made irrelevant by thermal sights and fire control computers. This wasn't just an American victory. This was American technology dominating Soviet technology so thoroughly that the battle became a one-sided massacre. 186 Iraqi tanks destroyed versus 0 American losses. Those numbers should be impossible between two armored forces of comparable size. They happened because the technology gap was insurmountable. The M1A1 Abrams came out of Desert Storm with a combat record that's still unmatched. 0 Abrams tanks destroyed by enemy fire throughout the entire war. Not one. Meanwhile, American Abrams destroyed hundreds of Iraqi tanks, often from ranges the Iraqis couldn't even shoot back from. The tank had been in service since 1980, and Desert Storm proved every dollar spent developing it was worth it. Iraqi propaganda never acknowledged what really happened at Medina Ridge. Baghdad radio kept broadcasting claims about heroic Republican Guard resistance long after the Medina Division had been annihilated. Saddam couldn't admit that his elite forces had been destroyed in a battle they never saw. That's not how dictatorships work. The Americans knew exactly what had happened. 7th Corps intelligence reports documented the entire engagement. They had satellite imagery, drone footage, battlefield assessments, prisoner interrogations. The picture was clear. Thermal imaging technology had changed warfare at a fundamental level, and only the Americans had it at scale. Coffee tastes better when you're winning, or so I've heard from people who were there. Other countries started demanding thermal sights for their armored forces after Desert Storm. The export market for Soviet tanks collapsed. Everyone wanted American technology, or at least Western technology, that could compete. The Russians eventually developed their own thermal systems, but they were years behind and never exported them widely. Medina Ridge was the battle that nobody saw. Iraqi tank crews couldn't see the Americans who killed them.